Good afternoon and welcome to Just Jocelyn. Today we have Laurie Ortolano, welcome. And we're just going to dive right on in because Laurie had court last week, 3 days, 6 hours a day on her own as a pro se litigant in the courts where anything goes. So at this point, I'm not going to belabor the point or anything. We're going to jump into, let's do a post-trial briefing. What went on? Where have we been? You can all go back and look at the other shows I've done with Laurie. Just go to Just Jocelyn on YouTube and you can see everything that we talked about if you're not quite up to date. But what the heck happened? Did that attorney show up and what was that like?
So it was pretty interesting. It was incredibly exhausting, first of all, for me. I sat pretty much on my own at the table. I had an assistant come for the morning one morning, and then the rest of the time I was on my own. Wow. And the city had their team of, 5 counsels working for them on their side. They have,
wait. The city had 5 attorneys on their side?
They're
against you?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So they had invested a lot of money, and this is all a right to know case. This is about open records for the Performing Arts Center, the downtown barriers, and
the one where Alex's shoes used to be.
The new construction of that facility and the records associated with that facility. The downtown barriers, the placement of the barriers and the plan with changing Main Street to 2 lanes, and these advisory groups called Tax Incremental Financing Advisory Boards, TIFs.
Those groups that in the next show we'll talk about the unconstitutionality of it because they have no authority.
Well, they are able to pocket taxpayers' money and spend it in very isolated areas, but it depletes the money from the general fund that gets spread across the whole city. So, they have a purpose, but they have to be used carefully and they have to be accounted for very well. I don't think we necessarily do the proper accounting, but that's a different time and place. So it covered some important issues that had to do with downtown. And the most important issue in there was the records of the Performing Arts Center.
Right.
Because that
if I remember, were they heavily redacted?
Well, I got a lot of redacted records from them. That was one part of the case that I had to actually pull out and make a separate case. Okay. But that whole project switched from a fully public project, a building in an art center that was going to be owned by the city,
to a private,
a public-private partnership
with a bank. I'm trying
to
remember this.
Yes.
Okay.
Where federal money was accepted through a special program to provide financing because the city was having a lot of stress at trying to raise bonds and go back to the taxpayers and show this increase in costs. So
15 million to 40 million?
Probably close to 40 on this project. So it started off as a $15.5 million project, and then. And as soon as you delay these projects, and it's true for every project, you delay them a year, you delay them 2 years, the price goes up. It's just a given.
Right.
So this thing got delayed and the price went up to 21 million, and then really total was 25 million, and the city said, okay, we're going to bond 21 and we're going to raise $4 million in private money from donations.
Okay.
From donors. They had a great deal of difficulty raising private money.
I would think so.
Nashua has a tough time raising private money. We are not like Keene or Laconia or other areas where they seem to do better with private fundraising. So we were sluggish on the fundraising, and the city recognized after 2 years, after 2 years from 2018 when they sort of set this initiative in place with the resolution until the end of 2019, when you look at the 990 form from the nonprofit that was taking in the donations, it was 81,000 they raised in 2 years, and they were targeting 4 million. So, and the public didn't know this back then. We just knew it wasn't going well, and the city didn't want to say how well it wasn't going, right? So they took on the federal money because they recognized the 4 million was going to be a problem, and the costs were still continuing to go up.
Escalate, yeah.
So they got involved with this federal program, and from where I sit, they did not do an adequate job telling the public that this was turning into a private partnership, that the building was going to be owned by a private company, that all the financial records and the construction were going to be controlled by a private company, and that the total cost of the project had moved up substantially towards $40 million. They did not disclose that. And to some extent, some people may say, well, We used $21 million bond proceeds. Who cares? Well, I care because we gave the guarantees for all of the loans and additional money. All the risk was assumed by the city of Nashua.
Which is the taxpayers.
That taxpayers took all the risk.
Yep.
And loans were made to a private corporation. A loan was given by the bank to this private corporation that the city set up. And we are essentially responsible for paying the interest on those loans. And in 7 years, when this deal disappears, it disappears in 7 years. It's a 7-year tax credit payout period. And the corporations can then be dissolved. But the loan from the bank for the construction does not go away. I believe the city incurred all the risk, and that loan will be transferred to the city.
And then the taxpayers are going to have to pay on
another $7.1 million. And I don't know if that's going to be picked up in a bond, but what's interesting is to cover all of this interest and the expenses of the center. Not only did the city buy the building and bond the whole project, but we're paying $500,000 a year in rent to cover the expenses associated with these companies, because these companies that were set up really had no revenue stream. They have no money or business.
Gee, where did I hear that before? Wasn't that somewhere with federal government and Joey B?
So that was sort of the landscape of it. And for this 3 days, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the judge did permit the attorney for the city, the deputy counsel, Celia Leonard, to become a witness. So she had to remove herself from the case and become a witness.
Okay.
She was my first witness on the stand on Wednesday. That was an incredibly challenging witness to have on the stand. And
well, number one, she's an attorney.
She's an attorney. She was very well coached by Russ Hilliard, who the city had hired to lead the team.
Another person.
Another outside lawyer.
Brought that.
And she was very resistant, obviously, to answering questions and was hiding a lot behind attorney-client privilege, which I feel was overly used because I wasn't looking for the communications between the attorney and the client.
Correct.
I was looking for the end result.
Yep.
And one of the areas I started with was, what have you done, or what kind of procedures, guidelines, or policies have you established to address Laurie Ortolano right-to-know requests over the time period of this lawsuit relevant to what I was after?
Right.
What have you put in place?
What have you done? Where are we?
And the answer was always, we comply with RSA 91A. And so that's a blanket answer that she was very trained and coached to say. But the reality was, what does that mean? How do you comply? And we're here in a big lawsuit about a failure to comply. So obviously there's some real questions here. And really what I wanted to get at is, have they done anything to improve the record process?
I'm guessing no.
No. I mean, I put in a right to know. Well, no and yes. I'll get to that. I did put in a right to know before the trial to gather all their policies and procedures and things that they've developed in the last couple of years to improve the process. And I got the response, no records exist. So that tells me one thing. But and when she was on the stand, there was a lot of, I don't remember. I don't recall. It's been a couple of years. Can you repeat that question? What are you referring to? Do you want me to read this? I can't read this. It's not clear enough.
I certainly would never hire her.
It was a super challenging day, and it lasted the whole day from 10 to 4. And the judge was very patient. He knew it was a tough interview to go through. Right. And I felt like the first hour and 15 minutes was rocky for me figuring out how I was going to wrestle this into place. It was going very well for the city. I'm sure the attorney for the city was saying, this is just where I want her, frustrated and unable to get answers. But I kind of adjusted into a groove. Okay. And I figured out what I had to do, and I felt like the afternoon was a lot better.
Good.
But still, no real definitive answers or ownership. And one of the ownership issues was the city formed these nonprofit corporations that were public. They wrote the bylaws.
Right.
They failed to approve the bylaws properly. She was responsible for overseeing those bylaws. Right. And I have a meeting, I have an email that says these look good for her approval of the bylaws as they were going to the corporate boards. But the bylaws were written as if the corporations were private. For profit with no disclosure. The meetings didn't have to be noticed, nothing.
So do you think potentially based on that they knew even back then it was going to be private?
I think they did. I think they definitely had an idea that this thing was going to an LLC.
Yep.
And they didn't want to tell us at the time because they had always pitched to us, it's going to be public, it's going to be public, it's going to cost this amount of money. So they didn't want to say, you know what, it's going to be private, we're going to pay rent, and it's going to be another 10 grand more. 10 million more.
Yep.
They didn't want to tell us that. That wasn't an easy sell story because it was a project that didn't have wide support. It was a 50-50 split.
Correct.
So when you have things like that, you have touchy situations. And, full disclosure is not the name of the game with Mayor Donchis and his administration.
Well,
this
is what we're seeing definitely in Nashua. We're seeing all over the state and definitely all over the nation that there just is no truth.
No.
They start off on one foot, end up on the other, and then basically decide, the legislators and mayors and aldermen and whoever, basically decide that we're too stupid to make any decisions for ourselves. And that's not, and I'm not being cruel, but they definitely, I've heard them in meetings across the board. Well, we have to decide what's best for them. We know what's best for them. They don't understand this. And we are looking at this playing out right in front of your face. I'm seeing it in my case and others, and we're being punished for being pro se litigants. And
it's hard.
And people say, well, you can just hire a lawyer. Nobody wants our cases because these are constitutional cases. And they either won't take them, can't take them, or being told don't touch it with a 10-foot pole, which I've heard multiple times. So we're having to represent ourselves and figure this out. And along the way, it's like running the gambit, and you got people throwing fruit at you and kicking you and screaming at you.
It's Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly. And you're trying to do your best, and you don't have anybody supporting you. We're doing it ourselves. We're supporting each other, and then we have the courts that are supposed to be not lenient, that's not the word, but are supposed to be patient with us.
Impartial,
balanced, and they're not.
It's a struggle.
Sorry.
So my biggest disappointment is that finding truth in the court has been so difficult for me because the city is so resistant to speak truthfully in court. And I think that has to be parsed out pretty quickly because this 3-day trial showed me that there was a lot of dishonesty going on that stand. So when Miss Leonard got off, when we brought in the next candidates, we had a consultant hired by the city, Neil Cannon, who was a tax expert, and he took the stand. He was very belligerent and very angry about anything to do with 91A because it wasn't his responsibility and he hadn't been told anything, and he raised his voice and he shouted. And he was an interesting person to me because I refreshed his memory that he had done a briefing for the public on December 15th of 2021, and I was present for that.
Correct.
And I said to him, do you remember me asking you a question on whether the corporation set up were subject to the right to know law, RSA 91A, so records were public? And he was very pleasant in that meeting. He said, great question, I honestly don't know. And Director Cummings was at this meeting, and he was facing me in the chair, and he looked at me, and then I looked over at him, and he spun around in his chair and faced the wall. Little did I know, 2 days earlier in that very room was a public meeting that was held, that was not properly noticed, that there were no minutes or records generated, and he could have easily said to me, Mrs. Ortolano, we just had a meeting. I will get those records up. I will put you on the notification list, and I will let you know when the next meeting is held. But he did not. He remained silent. And I was in a hearing where questions were permitted. So, that's why I look at the Constitution not working for me. RSA 91A says they don't have to answer questions. They only have to give records. But when you're sitting in a public forum, that's a Q&A forum, and you're asking questions of your government officials, and they spin around in their seat and ignore you. And then about 3 weeks later, I wrote to him and I said, hey, remember when I asked you in the forum if these were subject to the right to know law? You didn't answer me. What's the deal here? Never responded to that either. So, that's where Part 1, Article 8 should be valuable to us. An open, accessible, accountable, and responsive government is what we're about. And that's the part I didn't get.
Well, I think that's why they are not answering, because if they do answer, they're guilty.
Well,
because it's an admission.
Right. And the tricky part of this trial, what frustrated me is that the city produced answers in December of 2020 22 under court order. Was filed in August of 2022. By December, the city had to provide answers. The city provided answers to the lawsuit. They were very uninformative and vague. We haven't researched whether the website was wrong or it wasn't posted properly or minutes were not. We don't know. We haven't had time to research. I'm thinking, Jesus, it's been 4 months. How hard is it to check? So many of the violations in this suit involved the noticing of public meetings, the recording and use of the website for minutes and records, the control and custody of records, and who is considered a public body who would have those records in an accessible location for citizens to come and view their records under the right to know law. I was going after a lot of very basic things.
Well, if it's not accessible to the public, how is it accessible to them?
Exactly.
And if you're being asked for a 91A or any sort of legal request, I thought in our technological days that they'd go ding, 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 bink, here's the print, email it to you, because not only does it have to be accessible to you and we, the public, it needs to be accessible to any other legislative public servant. And this just screams to me and many other people, they're not doing any of it.
No, they weren't. And what happened, so this consultant was very belligerent on the stand. And all I can think is when I met him a couple of years ago and he did that briefing, he was such a kind guy. And at the end of the meeting, my friend and I went up and introduced ourselves. And he literally gave us his business card with his phone number and said, call me anytime. I'd be of assistance. Of course, I called him once and he never returned the call because I'm sure when he called the city and said, Laurie Ortolano called me, they said, don't talk to her.
I would have taken that card
lawn.
into court and said, may I approach Your Honor and say, oh, do you remember giving that to me in the meeting?
I know.
You said call anytime.
I know. Here you are.
Liar. Liar.
So then came on the president of the 3 corporations that were the shell corporations formed to enact this federal deal.
Yeah.
And he was more receptive to answering. And he said something super interesting, because the city took a position in their answers that these corporations were not public bodies or public agencies of the city, and therefore they were not responsible for noticing their meetings or posting their minutes. And I was like, wait a minute, these companies were formed by you. They have the same EIN number. There's so many things that are the same.
They're the same.
They're completely intertwined, and they're affiliated, and the attorney representing those corporations, they had to have their own counsel, and 2 attorneys were at the city table conjoined. They had a joint defense agreement, which I don't like those at all.
Was that like the little dream team?
It was the dream team. So, although I will say that it was Joe Foster and a guy named Grim Stedman from McLean Middleton that represented those corporations. And if I look at the 2 parties, Hilliard in the city and Foster and McLean, McLean was much more professional. Originally, they started out very tied to the city, really harsh on Laurie Ortolano. She's just a vexatious, hostile lady. And as the year progressed with the case, they swung more toward the other side of just being more neutral, I would say. And they opened a door.
Doing their job?
Yeah, they did. And they opened the door for me to call, invited me to call them anytime. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to talk to you. I was hesitant at first because I've been burned by the city so often on communication and hung out to dry in public meetings that I thought it was a trap, something to say. She didn't say something nice to us and, oh my God, she's horrible. And we go down that whole rabbit hole again. But I did call and I started using phone calls, not excessively, but when I had questions or needed to review a record or understand something, I called. And they were very receptive. They were extremely responsive. And as I started emailing them for assistance on a record, they were very responsive. I'd get something back in like 10 minutes. And if they were going to respond to something that they had to go to their board for or speak to their president about, they might need 5 days or 10 days, but they would take it and give it. The city, on the other other hand, would not. They don't return phone calls.
Right.
They wouldn't talk to me at all.
They wouldn't talk to you at all.
No.
Exactly.
And with an email, it was, we're going to wait the 5 days and stamp it. Even in this trial kind
Just
of
total
stuff.
avoidance.
Total
Total avoidance and not dealing with it and not doing their job and not being professional.
So they were not professional, and I was really disappointed with Russ Hilliard. Not because he has to like me or support my position, but he was so hostile, and it's always a bloodbath in the city. And it's tiring to be in that kind of battle. We're talking about public records. This is not a criminal case. Nobody should be going to prison over this. We're just trying to address open records and how things are being done. And we don't need to make this so personal and so hostile.
Correct, but they do.
But they do. So I will give some kudos to McLean for taking a different tact and giving me a different opportunity and never burning me with that opportunity. You know what I mean?
Actually running the case the way it should be and addressing it for what it was and not turning it, as you say, into a criminal personal case.
Right.
Where,
Laurie
you were
is just too
right.
terrible, too hostile. We can't work with her.
Which is
She's not worthy of
what the
getting her
left
record.
tends to do all
Right.
the time.
Constantly marginalizes the person addressing the issue. So the one thing that the president for these 3 companies said is he identified that the meeting minutes for all of their minutes were actually taken by Tim Cummings, assistant deputy economic development director. She physically took their minutes in the meetings. Now, they had their own secretaries on those boards to be the recorders, but the secretaries never recorded the minutes. The city did, which is another case and condition of why I say the city was really running those businesses. Plus, the city was at all the meetings. They were in attendance. They sat at the board of directors table. That's very integrated. I don't go to a board of directors meeting and they don't pull up a chair and say, "Oh,
Here,
Laurie,
come sit." Yeah.
come sit with the board."
Right.
But the city was sitting with the board, and the assistant, the deputy economic development director, was actually recording the minutes. That was a good piece of information for me. So when the city in their answers said, we're not responsible for posting or noticing, are you kidding me?
You took the notes and you sat at the table.
Minutes. And are you kidding me?
You had a place at the table.
The next guy on the stand was Director Cummings.
Okay.
And he was deeply concerning to me. The lack of honesty and the integrity. I actually worked to impeach him off a video I had of him and myself in a hallway on an interaction where he wrote a letter about it, claiming that I had approached him, I had been hostile, that I was sitting outside his door.
I remember that one, yes.
And so I brought in the letter he wrote, and I had preserved the video of that hallway. So I took pictures of the hallway, and I had actually written about that specific incident in my lawsuit. Paragraph 40, and I cited several right-to-know violations. First, I said, hey, you can't keep public records in a locked office. His office is locked, and the guy was holding a lot of public records. And I think what's happened is when Donnelly Lozone was mayor, the Economic Development Office was not a heavy project office. It was just an oversight group. It was doing 1 person, 2 people, doing outreach.
But it grew. And
it became the project arm to the mayor.
Right.
And the mayor put a ton of money and responsibility into that office, locked the door, made all the records inaccessible, and gave a ton of power to this guy, Tim Cummings.
Yeah.
And to say that he's an advisor is absurd. This guy's rolling decisions left and right, and his locked door is full of public records. Good luck trying to get him. And his whole office, everything I was challenging, Downtown Improvement Committee and the barriers, the Art Center, the TIFs, those were all under his control. Those were his projects and the committees of the city that were under his administrative regulation. There was a lot going on in there that wasn't being disclosed. When he took the stand, he was a nightmare. He took a page out of Celia Leonard's book, had been trained.
I don't know. I don't remember.
What date? Can you repeat the question again? Can you repeat it again? What's the email you want me to look at? What index number? What date? I don't remember. And I asked him repeatedly, did the 201 corporations, the shell corporations formed for this art center, were you the administrator and were you administratively responsible for those corporations? No. I said, well, you're responsible for TIFs. I had to pull it out of him too. Wow. When he sat on the stand and I said, what departments are you responsible for? He couldn't remember. What committees and commissions? I really don't know. You're the
You know what? They might as well have just said, I plead the fifth and folded their arms.
I know. So we had to pull, and I had to pull him through the mud.
So in the couple of minutes we have, would you say, because I know there's been several people, and they've done the same to me in different towns, where they say, you're just wasting taxpayer money.
Oh my gosh.
And you're doing this. When I hear this and what you're saying about these professionals who should know every little iota of everything they do, when they pull this kind of game and drag it into 3 days
Right.
and not do their job and not follow anything, they're the ones that are wasting taxpayer money.
They did a presentation on the 25th of March, the city, in the Public Board of Alder meeting, a special meeting and their public meeting, where they showed the outside legal expenses. And they developed a spreadsheet. It's Laurie Ortolano's name all over it, by name, showing how frivolous I am and all the money I waste. And this lawsuit that I took in last week, they had already expended in March, the beginning of March, $400,000. Now, I'm going to tell you, with that legal team on there and the other 3 days, that's a $600,000 suit. And there they are mounting $600,000 against me for records. And I know there's a lot of records claims in there I won, because Director Cummings, at the end of Friday, changed his position. And when I brought him back on the stand after lunch, he acknowledged that he was responsible for those 201 corps. And the posting of the meetings and the minutes was under his responsibility. The guy totally changed his testimony.
I wonder why.
Because they didn't want Judge Temple ruling on the corporate structure,
Gotcha.
which was not proper. So they wanted to keep the judge away from making a sort of declaratory judgment ruling to address my right to know claims. So they owned the fact that they should have done it to avoid the judge saying, these corporations are really yours. What are you talking about? They were yours all along. Because I presented the arguments to the judge that these are public bodies and public agencies of the city. They have the same EIN. They have the same board members are appointed by the city.
They were joined at the hip.
They were joined
Hang
at
on
the hip.
to that. Hang on to that. We're going to go to a quick break and start part 2 of this, because we need to continue this and then go on with Citizen Watchdogs. So we'll be right back. Don't go away. Watch for part 2 of Just Jocelyn with Laurie Ortolano, post-trial briefing, and we're going to run into Citizen Watchdogs.